What is up, guys? So basically, I have not had a lot of time recently. I'm not entirely sure how um how do I put this? I'm not entirely sure if I'll be able to edit this week's video in time. So I thought a fun sort of in between would be live stream while I paint. Fun fact, well, I don't know if it's technically a fun fact, but I'm actually working on the commission right now, which is why I haven't had the time to edit this week's video. Well, finish editing. So I thought it'd be nice instead to do a live stream while I paint. I'm not gonna paint for too long, probably 40 minutes or so, just to really set down the base for the commission for the skin because that's really all I have left in the portrait. But the skin also does take the most time, so I thought take you guys along the ride with me. That'll be fun, at least for me because I can talk while I paint. So I'm gonna start by mixing the skin color. I always start with brown as the base. It's the easiest thing to do. It's the fastest. That way I don't have to mix out my own brown. And this is just a burnt umber. But I do add, of course, some yellow, some red, and some white to make it a very realistic skin color. And I don't tend to add a lot of blue until I'm working on the shadows. But even then, it's not a ton. Um, that's just like personal preference, I think. I like making my skin tones look kind of orange. Maybe that's just me. But also, in this case, the person that I'm painting for the commission is a little bit more darker brown skin. So it does make sense to have it a little bit more saturated versus doing something a little more cool tone. That being said, darker skin still can be cool tone. Um, all depends on your reference. So in this case, I'm only taking out a little bit of paint, which is why I'm taking it from the cap versus squeezing out some paint, just because these are very big containers. And I like doing a watered down base first. I feel like that really helps sort of set the stage, especially when you're working with something like acrylic, which is generally very fast drying. And what I tend to do instead is work with it sort of in this watercolor method of slowly building up those colors into something solid. For the most part, I am going to be using this small brush. I tend to work with smaller brushes, that way I can go area by area. Um, versus doing one big area. I know not a lot of people prefer to do it that way. But I do. I think it just makes it a little bit more manageable. But to each their own. I also tend to use a lot of yellow. Yellow is a really nice color when you're lightening something up, especially when you're using white and when it comes to skin tones. Because white, when you add it to a color, it's going to take away the saturation. So if you're adding white to brown, you'll get an extremely pale brown, and that's not what I want. So not only does yellow lighten up the brown, but it'll also add in that saturation that the white is going to take away. And then, of course, I also use red to balance out that yellow. So we're not going like minion color. But red is also a very pigmented color. So I don't use a ton of it, just really enough to balance out the yellow. And in rare cases where I feel like I've gone too orange, I will bring in some blue. Like I said, that's not something I'm worried about at this stage because it is just a very watered down base to help me set the foundation. When it comes to white though, I will use a lot of it. I'm very generous with it. That's the word. Um, so I have actually used most of this. Luckily, I did buy some more recently. So I always start out by mixing the whites and the brown first. That really just helps me figure out where I'm at and helps me focus on the value first before I focus on the actual color. I like starting on the darker areas and working my way up to the lighter. I think that's just a little bit easier when you think about it in value because value is kind of tricky in the sense that you think something is dark, but until you have, or you think something is light, but until you have something dark next to it, it's kind of hard to gauge how light you need to go. So that's why I just prefer to do the darker first. You can definitely do it the other way, but I've just gotten kind of used to doing it this way. So I'm going to start out with a more orangey yellow. No, no, a more orangey color. Slightly leaning a little red for the shadow based on the reference picture that I'm using of the person that I'm painting. They have a little bit more red undertones. And I just want to show you guys real quick how much paint I'm mixing because it really is not a lot. That's all I'm mixing. So a little bit of yellow, brown, red, and white, and then the color that I mixed in the middle. And I do this because, like I said, I'm working with very watered down layers. And it's really not in my best interest to use or mix out a lot of paint. It just isn't the best option with the way that I paint. And I also keep a spray bottle handy literally at all times, regardless of what stage of the painting I'm in. And that's part of, just acrylic paint and how fast it dries. If that's something you're ever worried about, literally just adding water and making sure that the paint stays wet is the best thing that you can do. There are also special paint trays that you can use that has sort of this paper towel or cloth that you can wet beneath the actual paint palette, and that helps keep your paint moist, helps to stop it from evaporating too soon. And it's one of those things where it's like if you're having trouble with acrylic specifically because of how fast it dries, it will sort of change that game for you. But I do know that acrylic is also just not for everyone and not everyone's preference, which is entirely reasonable. And I get it. I've also tried out oil and watercolor. I love watercolor. It's actually the first sort of medium I used when it came to painting. So I am very used to it, and it has influenced a lot of the way I paint with acrylic, which is also why I have a bit of trouble with oil because it is a much slower dry time and just a different process entirely when it comes to blending and layering. Um, I feel like I'm patient, but I'm also not patient enough to use oil paint as often as I would like. I just feel a little bit more in tune with painting when it's using acrylic or using watercolor. However, I don't use watercolor as often nowadays, which is a little more to do with like what I've been painting, like portraits, which I find to be easier. And frankly, I get the look that I want with acrylic compared to watercolor. So, to give you guys an idea of what it looks like, basically extremely watered down and it's not a solid color, but it's just enough so that I can start building upon it later on. And this makes the entire like blending process a little bit easier too when working with acrylic because it allows you to get a very soft finish. If you've seen my other video where I made a portrait in 30 hours, I think that's the title that I went with. Um, it has a very soft and blended look in the end, despite the fact that, it is acrylic, which is known for being difficult when it comes to blending. And that's part of the reason why, because I really spend a lot of time and effort in just layering slowly. And while it does take quite a bit of patience, it does pay off. And the great thing about that also is that it is acrylic, so these thin layers will dry pretty fast. And I won't have to worry, you know, about waiting an hour or so for it to dry. It's usually just a couple of minutes. Now, I'm not showing you guys the actual painting, except for that brief clip, just because I do want to actually finish this and have, the person who's commissioning it be the first to see it complete. I feel like that's just I don't know what you would say, like, nice thing? I don't know. But until then, that's the only sneak preview you guys will be getting. Um, until, I see if she's okay with me sharing the painting and the image and all that. Because, like, that's always the thing, like, commissions, they're not for me. I'm doing this for someone, and especially when it comes to, like, making portraits of loved ones, I always want to be very respectful about it. But yeah, so I'm just focusing on the shadows right now. Taking my time. It's not really the most accurate color that I'm going for, but like I said, that's not really too important right now because I will be building over top of these layers. What's important is that I just start laying down that sort of value or that sort of shade beneath it So when I do add the actual color on top, it's gonna, how would you say? It's gonna fit a little bit better. It's gonna look a little bit better. You know, if anybody does makeup out there, it's sort of like when people put like primers and color correctors underneath their foundation, because even though you're not gonna really see it, it will affect, the end result. So far, when it comes to this painting, I spent quite a few hours on it. I think it's been, I want to say 12 so far, which isn't too bad. It's not that much, but I did start with the simpler stuff first, the background, the clothes, and all that. Um, I do this for a couple of different reasons. I partially like starting, with the background, with the clothes, because it gives me the sense of value, how dark or how light I'm going to have to go, especially when it comes to once I go and paint the face. It's a little bit easier to have those relative values there. But it's also just because it's simpler. Like, easy as that. Sometimes it is a little intimidating to, start out with the skin and paint a really realistic or sort of realistic portrait. So sometimes it just, really takes the pressure off. And by the end of it, I have a canvas that is no longer blank, and it's a little bit less daunting to start. But yeah, I'm liking how it's looking so far. There were a little bumps in the road, but that was with the color, which just wasn't coming out the way I liked. But eventually I did get there. I just sort of had to adjust the actual like saturation of the color, which was what was throwing me off. And what's actually very interesting about this portrait and different from some of my other portraits is how limited a color palette this is. Because essentially all that it will be once I'm finished is literally just blue and shades of brown. And that will be essentially it. And they will be like an orange leaning brown, which is a very like nice complementary color to all the blues that's going on, and it's going to be a very nice way to have the skin and the face sort of stand out from the clothes and from the background, which I'm really excited to see what will happen. I think blue and orange, it's always such a nice combo. And I have done a portrait before with actual blue and actual orange, not just like varying shades. But and it came out really cool. And I did like the look of it, but I think it'll be really interesting to see how that will kind of translate into this, where I'm trying to go for a little bit more realistic look. And I try to be as intentional as I can with where I'm placing the colors because, like I said, it's very important to get that foundation right because it will make your life so, so much easier once you're actually, turning it into solid colors, the right colors, and really developing it a little bit more. A, lo- a limited color palette is also great when you're someone who maybe isn't as confident in their color skills as they would like to be. Because like once you decide like what colors go well together, like that's it. Like you can just do an entire thing of like I'm doing blue with orange or like a yellow green and violet and combine it that way and just unify it that way and you don't have to worry about whether or not the colors in the end will look good. And I try to always keep my reference picture on hand and just check back on it. Even if I'm not trying to go for the most accurate colors right now, it's still really useful to make sure that I'm getting the values right, the area right, because if I'm putting a shadow where there isn't a shadow or a highlight where there shouldn't be, it does affect the end result because people just aren't lines or shapes. They are the shadows and the highlights of their face, especially when you're trying to do something that's a little more realistic. And it'll affect it a lot because the way your face has certain shadows or highlights suggests also the form of your face. So even like if you have the line right, your face that you're drawing might still look a little off because the shadows or the highlights are in a wrong place or in an odd place that it shouldn't be. Which is why you get stuff like people sort of like looking uncanny sometimes. Like it's so close to looking like them, but it isn't. And that's, part of treating people's faces like a three-dimensional form, like it is. And that's the, like, part of the more important things that I've had to learn, especially as someone who dedicates her time to making portraits. And like I've taken I don't know, probably like 3 or 4 classes on figure drawing, on anatomy, and it's really helped me a lot, and it's just like those little things that you don't really think about, but it's super important to the process of making a portrait. Yeah. Another reason why I just like mixing out small bits of paint as I go is because I can just adjust from there rather if I made like this big batch of paint or pre-mixed a couple of different shades, that's just not what I like doing. I like mixing as I'm going and also adjusting as I'm going, depending, on the area that I'm working in, because I am working in very small groups, especially, working with acrylic. It is sort of a race against time and, trying to blend it out before it dries. So working in smaller areas really helps with that. And like I said, just keeping a spray bottle handy is always helpful, always recommended. It really helps keep your paint from evaporating. And also, in my case, where I like working with paint that's a little more watered down, so I can layer it and eventually create a very blended finished portrait, a spray bottle is very, very handy. If you see me looking off to the side, I have my iPads up so I can see the reference picture. So far, I feel like it's been pretty accurate. I have taken some creative liberties, um, but they have been approved by the person who's commissioning this piece. And honestly, when it comes to making a painting for someone, I'm always so excited for a couple of different reasons. Part of it's just like, obviously it's like work, making something for somebody, but it's also like I'm always like excited to see what their reaction is going to be like. Even when it's just like when I'm making a present for someone, I think that's so much fun. And seeing them like either be like surprised or happy or I don't know. But there's a lot of joy in that, in giving something to someone that's special. And that obviously like I've spent hours doing. So yeah, I'm just blending out the brown. Sorry, not blending, mixing. Mixing out the brown, red, yellow, white, and just adjusting that section at a time. I'm not really expecting to get much done today just because I do have some other stuff that I'm gonna have to do after this. But I think this will really help me, sort of ease into it. Portraits always kind of have that feeling of, being a little daunting. And especially like when it's a commission or you're doing it for someone, because you do want it to like look accurate. But taking it slow is always a good way to go about it. And just layering it the way I do is also great for, establishing undertones. In this case, the person that I'm painting has a lot of sort of these red, pinkish undertones. So this is a great time to start establishing that so that later on when I'm painting and I have a more solid color, it's not gonna look straight up red. It's gonna look very natural, like the red is peeking through. Like how it works with any underpainting. Um, I do have a video on like my underpainting process. This is a little bit different though. The underpainting video that I made, it's more focused on value, which I do think is super helpful, especially as someone who struggles a bit with color and specifically like seeing the value in certain colors. So like having the value established underneath and then that way I can just build the colors on top and not necessarily worry about whether the contrast is there is super helpful. However, in this case, it's sort of like a combination of that where I am focusing on value, but I'm also adding in a little bit of color. Again, I'm not doing like a full range. I'm not going super realistic on the colors yet. It's all just kind of slightly different tones of brown, but it's still very helpful for the end process. And just layering in general is really amazing when it comes to acrylic and wanting a very nice blended out portrait for the end without also having to worry about having to blend acrylic very quickly because blending wet into wet acrylic is kind of a nightmare because it is in fact like a race against time. So this is like a nice way to get around that where it's like you have a blended finished product but you didn't actually have to do a lot of blending to get there, which is definitely influenced by, the fact that I learned how to paint with watercolor and layering in watercolor is essential basically to really get that either a very solid color or a blended color. So I definitely draw a lot of inspiration from there. I also think just like number one, just be patient with yourself. Painting is not an easy task, and it will always take a lot of time. I think you also just kind of have to be willing to make bad art, which is not something you probably want to do. And like I've definitely had to sort of learn to accept that. But it's the truth, you can't really get better if you're not willing to be bad first. And also accepting that just kind of take some of that pressure away. So I'll give you guys one little peek. It looks a little crazy right now, but it is a very much trust the process. There we go. So you can see I've got some different, values, different tones going on. And it does look a little crazy, but it's going to be a great foundation to build upon later. And I showed this process in one of my recent videos about making a portrait. I believe I titled it like making a portrait in 30 hours, something like that. And that might be the thumbnail, I don't know. But before that, I hadn't really done an acrylic portrait like that. And that's also because, the last time that I had done an acrylic portrait, strictly acrylic, was, I want to say, like 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe even 6. But yeah, that was the last time I had like truly attempted to do a sort of realistic acrylic portrait. And like since then, I have done some more realistic portraits, but a lot of them had been with oil or a mix of acrylic and oil. So it was a really fun challenge, which I definitely enjoyed because I'm now doing it again. The interesting thing about it was, oops, that for so long I've heard that, oil is such a easy medium when it comes to blending, and it's so great for making like a realistic portrait and all that stuff. So like that's why I like felt the need like, oh, if I'm gonna make a realistic portrait, it just makes more sense to do it, with oil. But then, I tried it with acrylic and it just like something clicked in me and I was like, oh yeah, this is what I'm supposed to be doing versus, using oil. And obviously it depends on the person and like what they like. But I just found acrylic to be, how would you put it? I wouldn't say easier, but it just made more sense for the way I paint. I'll say that. Because I do like working in these sort of very watered down layers the way you would with watercolor. And while I have a lot of patience, I also want to be able to layer things immediately. And I found that with oil, it was a little bit harder to do that because if I were to put another layer on top, it would kind of start to blend. And I didn't really want that to happen. So yeah, you just kind of have to consider what you like and what will work best for you versus trying to do what, you know, other people think is best. Another thing, if you're like having trouble with like portraits, and this is just a really good tip that I've gotten from various professors, is literally just stand up and look at it from far away. And I know that sounds like extremely simple, but it's true. Like being so up close to your painting, sometimes like you'll forget. Well, you won't forget. You'll like miss certain things because you're so up close and personal. And it also helps, like, if you're struggling with value, or like proportions, because you'll really be able to see it a little more clearly when you're far away. Especially value, because value is just one of those things that with color it can be a little bit harder to gauge. But good value, and specifically a large contrast in value, should be easy to read from far away. So let's say if from far away you can't really tell, oh, this is where the eye is, this is where the shadow is. You're not having enough contrast in the face or in whatever you're painting. So at the start of the stream, I said that I was going to start in the darkest areas first. I did not do that. I say that and then I never do it. Ideally, you start with the darkest areas of your portrait, or frankly, whatever you're working on, to really help you establish the value first. Because knowing how dark your painting will be, it lets you know how light you can go, in the sense that, you don't always need like a pure white against the black to make it look white. You can sometimes use just like a light gray. But I do not follow that. Not all the time. I try to, but very naturally I tend to just jump around. And it's not the end of the world if you do jump around, or if you don't do the dark parts first. And the nice part about layering skin this way is that it really does take some of that pressure off. because then you're not building on top of white. You're building on a base that's already there and setting that stage for you. Definitely, I think the things that have helped me most with my portraits is one, anatomy, obviously, having that foundation of understanding is extremely helpful when drawing, when figuring out where shadows go, especially like if I'm working from a reference picture that maybe isn't the clearest, because then I have sort of this knowledge to build up on. Also, once you understand anatomy, you understand light source. And if you have, let's say, light coming from above, so what I have going on, you understand that the light hits here because this protrudes outwards. You understand that there's shadow on this side because it's going in, it's going this way, so the light won't hit it directly. So it's little things like that. And then obviously color. I forgot what I was painting. Um, yeah, learning color, and if you know you're not comfortable with using color quite yet, keeping it simple, using a limited color palette always helps. Um, Also, you know, complementary color, complementary, complementary colors. There we go. Super helpful. So I think I'm just gonna finish out the ear and call it a day. And I'll show you guys real quick how that's looking. So that's how we're looking. As you can see, it's starting to look a little less crazy. It's starting to look a little more like a face, but still has quite a way to go. But yeah, that's it for now. I don't know, maybe I'll live stream again soon, who knows. Um, Not my favorite form of making a video, but it is a form. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, calling it a day. Bye, guys.